Founders Longevity Forum Singapore is going to be a unique event brought to you by Founders Forum, the Academy for Healthy Longevity at the National University of Singapore, and of course, Longevity.Technology. Now, this event is going to bring together global leaders, clinicians, academics, investors, everybody from around the world to increase knowledge about the overall longevity sector and, of course, to drive growth. Now, longevity clinics, as we all know, and wider geroscience are key themes for the conference. And who better to speak to than someone who's really at the very forefront of both? Dr. David Dodick is the Chief Science and Medical Officer at Atria, which boasts a multidisciplinary team of scientists, physicians, public health experts, and so on. And he's also a key speaker at the event, and he's joining us today. So, David, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Phil. Thank you for having me.
Oh, well, great. Well, obviously, David, you've had a stellar career at the Mayo Clinic. So interested to know what made you jump from Mayo to Atria.
Well, Phil, maybe it's that I think I saw the future, and the future around preventive health, health in general, and health span. So, medicine these days is reactive. It's sick care. That's the way I practiced for 32 years. As a neurologist, I'm a neurologist. And when patients have symptoms, they come to me. We do our best to make a diagnosis, and then we do our best to try to manage, palliate, rehabilitate, or treat those symptoms. But in the space of neurology, even a whole discipline of preventive neurology has been born in the same way that back 70 years ago, the whole field of preventive cardiology was born. And now it's very commonplace for preventive heart health to be embedded and integrated into primary care, because a number of modifiable risk factors for heart disease was identified through the Framingham Heart Study over a several decade long experience. And so I think with brain health right now, I believe that we'll be talking about the health of the brain in the same way we've talked about the health of the heart over the next 50 years.
Yes,
and
yes.
I believe that preventive neurology and the need to look after one's brain, the ability to identify the health of the brain through simple blood tests, if you will, is upon us. And so in a way that really hasn't been the case before, preventive neurology and the ability to optimize cognitive performance and prevent the cognitive decline that we've just inevitably ascribed to the process of aging, I think is upon us. So I saw where the future of medicine is going, with medical knowledge doubling every 2.5 months.
Yep.
It's an unstoppable force. And so because of that, I felt like here's the opportunity to try to be at the tip of the spear, the leading edge, and try to contribute to the development of this whole field of preventive healthcare and longevity and optimizing biological health span.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. Well, of course, we're all experiencing the acceleration of the space, as you say. And of course, really, in terms of the concepts around neuroscience, there's so many new therapeutics coming through clinical phases and so on. I agree with you that there's going to be a very exciting future for really tackling that big disease of age that most people are petrified about, right?
Exactly.
And I guess that with Atria's approach, how would you say that it differs from traditional institutions? You mentioned, obviously, sick care, primarily coming now into really healthcare as it really should be. But how are you addressing aging conditions at Atria?
Well, we deeply phenotype each patient, Phil. So we go very deep on patients. So we do whole genome sequencing, and we do a full suite of omics. We do whole body imaging. So the amount of data that we collect per patient is unprecedented in my experience, even coming from an institution that is a global gold standard in treating complex disease. And then we have an ecosystem here, a preventive healthcare ecosystem, where we have an exceptional and exemplary group of internal medicine specialists surrounded by teams of integrative health specialists, metabolic health specialists, brain health specialists, heart health specialists, movement and human performance experts, expert dietitians. So we in a very sophisticated way, collect all of this data, synthesize, analyze, interpret the data, come together and align on recommendations. And in a very customized way, you can imagine, based on all of that data, really personalize the health care of that person.
Yeah.
Health care and health span is recursive, Phil. In other words, what you look like at the age of 60 very much depends on how you looked after yourself and the care that you've gotten at the age of 50 which very much depends on what you did at the age of 40 and so on. So we take a very whole health approach here. We go from pediatrics to geriatrics, and it's a very longitudinal approach. So it's we see patients frequently in follow-up. So it isn't just that we collect a lot of data, make some recommendations, and send people back to their primary care physicians. We are their primary care physicians. We are their specialists. So when you come to Atria, you have an internist, but you also have a neurologist, a cardiologist, a men's or women's health expert, an endocrinologist, a metabolic health expert, a human performance movement specialist who will customize stability, agility, fitness, resistance, aerobic training program. We will customize your nutrition based on nutrigenomics and other factors associated with your metabolism. So we take a very customized approach, and then we follow and track people very carefully. We are in the age of digital medicine as well, with a lot of digital health technologies. So collating all of the wearables, patchables, nearables that patients have into something that makes sense for both them and their clinician, integrating that into their health, I think is something that we're going to see more of in the future. We're already seeing this in CES 2025. We're seeing from the Consumer Electronics Show, we're seeing some of the technology that's going to become available. So we have a digital health program here where we're trying to ensure that all of that data that's being collected is made sense out of. And it's not just sitting on a person's phone, if you will, but it's actually being integrated into their care.
Yeah, and David, I guess that there's so much complex data available, and having an integrated team working together, perhaps you're working on somebody's cardiovascular fitness, maybe you're helping them with perhaps the early stages of some mild cognitive impairment. It must be super complex trying to pull all of that together and have a care team delivering against the same objectives.
It is super complex because in my experience, I come from one of the oldest integrated practices of medicine in the world. But what makes this truly integrated is if you have a dozen physicians and experts sitting in a room poring over the data for one patient and then aligning on recommendations. And by the way, because medical knowledge, as I said, is doubling every 2.5 months, and there will be 100,000 medical research papers published this month, it's impossible for a single physician or even a group of even the best physicians and experts to sit in a room and to keep up with medical progress. So this ecosystem that we built in sort of an onion-shaped model, we have a team behind the team. So we've built out an academy of science and medicine, which is kind of like a think tank that we can then turn to in cases where we can't align or there are things that we're just uncertain about. So we can phone a friend, if you will, and call upon an expert and get current best thinking on any question, topic, or issue that might arise on a particular patient. So in that way, we think we bring the best that medicine has to bear. We're truly translating science into medicine real time instead of waiting the 15 to 20 years that it takes from a discovery to actually make it to the bedside.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there's so much new tech, as you say, and of course, AI is playing a big part in everybody's thinking at the moment. And you mentioned CES, of course, there are lots of new wearables and lots of new concepts coming through. But maybe we should just talk a little bit about the therapeutic side of things. Are there any therapies on the geroscience space, whether it's specifically to cognitive function or others, that excite you at the moment?
From a systems biology standpoint, it's reasonable to assume, although different organs age at different rates, it's reasonable to assume that there's a shared underlying biology by which those organs age. And so, because many of the diseases, chronic diseases that occur, whether it's heart disease, neurodegenerative disease, or what have you, diabetes, hypertension, these are diseases of aging. Aging is the risk factor. So if you have a gerotherapeutics that delays the biology of aging, it's very likely to have a sort of a system-wide impact, not only on the heart, not only on the liver, not only on the kidney, not only on the vasculature, but also in the brain. So there are gerotherapeutics that are being evaluated right now as a way to sort of identify who may be at risk for neurodegenerative disease, like Alzheimer's disease, for example, and try to intervene early, because many of the therapies that have been tested for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease are being deployed at a time when that disease has been incubating for 20 or 25 years. So there's been extensive damage to the network that's already occurred. And what you're trying to do is sort of mitigate, blunt, and stop that damage from continuing to occur. But whether that leads to, boosting of cognitive health and cognitive performance is another matter. So the goal of preventive neurology is really to identify those in the same way we identify people with hypercholesterolemia, people with hypertension, and manage those risk factors early on to prevent people from developing atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. We're doing that now for the brain. And so when you look at gerotherapeutics from metformin to GLP-1 agonists to senolytics, these are all being evaluated in clinical trials now in people who are identified as being at risk for neurodegenerative disease, to see if you can stave off or delay or impede or mitigate the actual appearance of symptoms. So can you prevent the disease from expressing itself?
Yeah.
By suppressing the pathology. So there are a number of gerotherapeutics, some of which I just mentioned, that look to be very exciting, where you have, just take the example of a GLP-1 agonist, which seems to be being used for everything these days, although they were developed for
Yes,
diabetes.
that's right.
They're now being deployed for weight loss. They certainly have a profound effect on cardiovascular and metabolic health, and so are indirectly protective for the brain. But they also seem to be directly neuroprotective in the brain, because GLP-1, of course, is a neurotransmitter. There are receptors in the brain for GLP-1 agonists. And so their ability to powerfully suppress inflammation in the brain and boost stem cell proliferation and boost energy production in the brain look to be very promising as a potentially neuroprotective drug. So, I think the future is very exciting.
And I guess we've seen a lot of, GLP-1 agonists are everywhere, of course, and they're probably one of the most studied therapeutics at this stage. And I guess that the key thing is that we're all discovering as we go along, but there are challenges, right? So, we're all aware of what's happening with the concepts around weight loss from a social media perspective, but really what happens in the clinic is what interests us. But what would you say are the challenges that we have now in really translating this neuroscience into everyday clinical practice? I guess that there's peer review, there's customer demand, there's obviously a lot of complexity around this from both sides. How do you feel we as an industry should be trying to maybe even accelerate some of these therapeutics, because we can see their benefit, and really in some respects it takes too long for a lot of people?
It takes far too long, and it's really, drug development is a very slow, very laborious, very expensive process. And so, my concern is it takes a long time to generate the kind of placebo-controlled evidence that regulators require to approve a medicine, because that has to happen before it makes it into clinical practice. Now, physicians use medicines off-label all the time, every day. However, when one does that, one needs to be have the capacity to follow those people in a longitudinal fashion very carefully, have metrics for success that you're measuring and monitoring, and have metrics and be able to monitor for adverse events. So if you start, for example, since we're on the topic of the GLP-1 agonist, if you have a person who's genetically at risk, let's say for Alzheimer's disease, and they happen to have a little visceral adiposity, they happen to be a little overweight, their glucose disposal and homeostasis appears to be a little bit off, then you may want to start a GLP-1 agonist in that particular patient for reasons other than neuroprotection. But by the way, since you're starting it and the person is at risk, we can sort of conduct an N of 1 study, if you will, right? And follow this patient, have outcome measures that assess the cognitive health and performance of that individual, while at the same time monitoring for the potential adverse events that can occur, the most prominent of which could be muscle mass. We lose 1% of muscle mass every year after the age of 50. And that leads to sarcopenia, that leads to frailty, that leads to falls, that leads to morbidity. So monitoring for the loss of muscle mass and trying to mitigate the loss of muscle mass, if that's occurring, is something that if you're going to use a drug, you need to be able to follow and track that patient carefully. So my concern really is around the way we conduct clinical trials now. It takes far too long, and people are, including myself, impatient, right?
Yes.
I don't want to have to wait the next 10 years out to know that this treatment I should have started 10 years ago. So
Yeah.
it's important. Safety is paramount and above all else. But at the same time, if what we have the capacity here to do is we're very much a technology-enabled practice where I can do, for example, a very high-resolution body composition profile using MRI to be able to track muscle volume and muscle mass in a patient who I start on a GLP-1 agonist. So I'm able to track and follow that. I'm also able to track serum markers as well as imaging markers to see, as well as functional markers, to make sure that it's having the desired effect. Maybe I'm changing the size of the hippocampal volumes, for example. Maybe I'm changing the expression of biomarkers in the blood that indicate, sort of neuronal degeneration. And
Yeah.
maybe I'm able to follow and track the fact that, lo and behold, I'm able to improve this person's working memory, their cognitive performance, their executive function, their processing speed. So my hope is that we accelerate the speed with which we evaluate these drugs, both for efficacy and safety. I think there's a gerotherapeutics network that's actually trying to do that. Unfortunately, we don't really have a well accepted and established biomarker for aging, but we have some functional metrics that we can follow and track. So the combination of accelerated decentralized clinical trials, the acceleration of N of 1 trials, the amassing of real world evidence, so carefully constructed databases, which is what we have here. We have a registry where we're putting all of our data into this de-identified registry. And so longitudinally over time, we're going to be able to sort of look back and make at least evaluate what the impact of, let's say, since we're on the topic of GLP-1 agonist, has had on cognitive performance, has had on muscle mass in a very carefully phenotyped and monitored patient population. So that's my hope for the future, that we get much more nimble in the way and much faster in the way we're evaluating the efficacy and safety of these drugs.
Excellent, David. Yeah, I guess that is one question that's on the back of my mind, of course, is that that's very expensive work. It's lots of touch points with the client or the patient. How do you see the works of the likes of Atria, as you mentioned, collecting anonymized data? How do you see the benefits that some of the private clients are going to get spilling out over into the wider populations? The sort of the demographic time bombs that most developed societies are leaning into now. Do you see a role between public and private for the work that you're doing at Atria?
I absolutely do. Our ultimate goal is to build a model of preventive healthcare, validate that model, and then share it with as many people to help as many people as humanly possible. How do we do that? We publish our findings. We merge and share databases, both public and private, because we're not the only ones out there collecting a lot of data and a lot of longitudinal data. And there are groups around the world who are doing superb work. Why can't we share resources? Why can't we merge these databases? So there's that. And then opening up our database, not only internally for our own faculty, but open it up for clinicians and scientists around the world to be able to access this database and do the kind of analytics that are going to contribute to knowledge. Once that knowledge is shared with the community and with medical providers, then there will be increasing health literacy in the community, and people will be empowered to take matters into their own hands, as well as will make the medical community more fluent in some of this new and emerging clinical science and data that we're generating, so that when patients come into their office, they'll be able to have good conversations with their patients and be able to guide them. Because right now, if a patient walked into a primary care physician's office and wanted to have a conversation around a GLP-1 agonist or rapamycin or metformin or senolytic and what it means for their cognitive health, I don't know that that conversation across primary care physicians' offices is going to be as fluent as it needs to be and as it should be in the future. So sharing this freely and making it available freely with no firewalls, no cost, is the only way to make this available to people at scale. So we have a public health foundation here, and one of the, Atria is kind of a stool with three legs. We have this we have this academic think tank, we have the institute that's building and validating this model, and we have a public health foundation whose primary focus is to scale this for as many people as possible.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear. I mean, we've just completed a longevity clinic survey, and there's about 70% appetite to share anonymized data. And I guess that probably what you need to be able to do to have shared anonymized data that's scalable, viewable, understandable is to have some common standards, right? So I think that the concept around running a longevity clinic, a preventative clinic, is all happening in silos at the moment. Do you see that there's an opportunity now for the industry and the profession to come closer together, set standards, build openness, and rather than have people doing discrete studies, actually having a massive centralized system where everybody can learn and benefit from?
I absolutely see that happening, and I particularly see it happen in the field of longevity. Okay. I saw it up close and personal at ARDD in Copenhagen in 2024. I was so taken by the inclusiveness of that community, how fast it's grown, but how they embrace people into that community and how they're willing to sort of work together, collaborate, and share knowledge and share resources. I happen to have been able to recruit a number of the leading longevity experts onto the Atria Academy, and they have been nothing but collaborative and friendly and wanting to work together truly in a way that's really exceptional. So I see this field in particular, because they know that this is going to grow into its own discipline. They want to establish the best benchmarks and set the standards for how this field grows. And they know that they not only want to work together, but work with other disciplines. They want to work with the cardiology community. They want to work with the brain community. They want to work with the metabolic community, because it is in those areas where those are the chronic diseases that we need to affect. So sharing knowledge, sharing resources, sharing skills is going to be absolutely necessary. I see it happening, and I particularly see it happening in this field of longevity medicine and longevity science.
Yeah, I would echo that myself, David. I mean, I've been in the industry for 7 years now, and I've seen a huge acceleration in the last 24 months now. And I guess that there's always a concern as an industry goes over the chasm and becomes more mainstream, that large corporations get involved, large health systems get involved, and we might hit the treacle, and build into the sort of commercial infrastructures that are there that are kind of built around the sick care paradigm at the moment. So I think there's probably a large political, ethical, and philosophical approach that's required to not only support the work that's happening within the industry, but likewise to actually help ensure that the politicians and the policymakers really understand what's happening.
Yeah, and I think the timing might be right, because the growth in the longevity field has been very organic, and it's been academics and clinicians kind of leading the charge and growing this in the right way, growing this field in the right way. They've recognized the need to collaborate, and it's happening at a time when there is a movement against chronic disease, both politically and socially, because we understand what can be done to prevent these diseases in the first place. So I think we're starting to see a real shift from sick reactive care to proactive preventive care. We're seeing a war being declared on chronic disease. There's no reason why 80% of people over the age of 60 are carrying at least 2 chronic diseases. That should not be the case in 2025. So I think the stars are beginning to align, where there may be a political will and ability to accept and embrace a preventive healthcare model, and to be able to set up an infrastructure that reimburses and supports that model in the way that it hasn't up to date. And we see at the same time a whole field of longevity and preventive health that's growing and building. And hopefully the stars will align, those two things will come together, and we'll see some real movement and impact that will be brought to bear on primary care physician and other healthcare providers' offices around this country and around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, let's talk about what's happening around the world. We've got Founders Longevity Forum Singapore coming up. You're one of our key speakers. What would you say that you want attendees to come along and learn and take away from a conference like this?
That the future is here. I would want everybody to be inspired and want to get involved. I would want people to try to be integrating this to the extent that they can in their own practice. And I would want people to be inspired by the fact that things that they never thought were possible, especially when it comes to brain health, are here today. We shouldn't treat aging as a reason to expect an inevitable decline in cognitive function. There's even memes out there like senior moments. We treat this as an inevitable consequence of aging. It doesn't have to be that way, right? There are things that we can be, should be, need to be doing at an early age. Look, I have two children in their 20s and 30s. They need to be looking after their brain today. Not that they necessarily should be thinking or dwelling on what's going to happen to them at the age of 65 or 75 or 85. But just from the standpoint, who doesn't want a cognitive edge, and who doesn't want to boost their cognitive performance now and protect and preserve the thing that defines us, which is our brain, right? We couldn't be having this conversation. I couldn't be speaking in Singapore were it not for my ability to perform cognitively. So the very thing that, and as you said early on, Phil, it's an existential concern for many of us, right? It's the one thing that none of us want to lose as we age. It's the one thing we're fearful of. And when you ask people, do you want to live to be 100? Do you want to live to be 110? Do you want to live to be 120? If they say no, what they're saying is they're seeing in their mind's eye the frailty and the cognitive decline that occurs with aging. And of course they don't want that. But if they could perform cognitively at the age of 100, like they perform at the age of 50, and if their physical and emotional performance were at 100 like it is at the age of 50, who wouldn't want that, right? So I think there are things that we can do today in 2025 to protect, preserve, and enhance one's cognitive ability and cognitive performance. And I would want people to start deploying that in their everyday practice and in their everyday life, both for them and their loved ones, as well as their patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, just to round us off, in terms of the conference, we've got a mixture of neuroscience experts, clinicians, therapists, but also we've got investors coming, we've got startups coming. What would you say to people outside of the clinical sphere that are kind of looking to get into this space, that are trying to innovate new technologies and fund new technologies? What do you feel is the appetite out there for people to get into this space now?
I don't think now compared to even 3 years ago, I think this is going to be $1 trillion industry. Look, in this country alone, we spend $4.3 trillion a year on healthcare, and the overwhelming majority of that goes to sick care. Can you imagine if that investment, an equal investment or a shift in that investment, was put into preventive healthcare? Can you imagine what that would mean for the health of a population? So I think the appetite has never been greater because of all of the noise. It's just in the ether right now, where people are thinking about health and what they can do to promote their own health and to live a healthier, longer life. So I think the environment is ripe for this right now. I think there's so much investment already happening in this field, and so many investors and so much venture money looking to get into this field because they see what's on the horizon. So they of course there are investors going to be at a meeting like this, because this is where the science is happening, and this is where they begin to understand and be able to identify what therapies and what groups look to be emerging and look to be on the cutting edge of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, David, we very much look forward to seeing you in Singapore. We've only got a couple of months now. We're even down to weeks. So wish you a safe flight, and we'll see you in Singapore.
Thank you, Phil. I'm looking forward to seeing you and looking forward to seeing everybody over there.